They killed the man at the center of Iran's war machine. The world saw the headline. Almost nobody saw the trap. If you value serious analysis that cuts through noise and spin, subscribe to the channel and stand with us. That support is what keeps this work sharp, honest, and worth your time. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. Israel's killing of Ali Larijani looks, on the surface, like one of those moments that changes a war. It is dramatic. It is precise. It is the kind of strike that sends a message far beyond the battlefield. No office is safe, no title can protect you, no layer of the Iranian state is beyond reach. For Israel, this is not just a military success. It is a demonstration of deep intelligence penetration, operational discipline, and strategic patience. It tells Tehran that the walls are thinner than they thought. But this is exactly where serious analysis has to begin, not end. Because in modern war, the most dangerous mistake is confusing a spectacular hit with a settled outcome. Israel may be winning the most visible part of this war. That does not mean it is winning the war that actually matters. Ali Larijani was not just another official. He was part of the connective tissue of the Iranian state. After the killing of Ali Khamenei, Larijani was widely seen as one of the few men capable of helping hold Tehran's wartime structure together. He mattered because he linked power centers. He could move between security, politics, crisis management, and state coordination. Men like that are not built overnight. They are accumulated over decades. So yes, Israel landed a real blow. A heavy one. A sophisticated one. But wars are not won by the emotional force of a headline. They are won by controlling escalation, managing costs, holding alliances together, and shaping what comes after the strike. That is where the picture gets darker. Because while Israel proves it can reach the top of Iran's leadership pyramid, Iran is proving something else: it can still move the cost of this war outward. It can still make the region bleed. It can still shake oil markets. It can still keep Hormuz under pressure. And once that happens, this stops being a story about one assassination and becomes a story about system-wide instability. That matters deeply to an American audience. Americans do not live inside this war through maps of Tehran or Beirut. They live through it when gasoline rises, when shipping risk climbs, when inflation pressure returns, when allies start splitting, and when Washington cannot clearly define the finish line. A war in the Middle East is never only a military event. It is a financial event, a political event, and eventually a household event. That is why this moment demands discipline. Not applause. Not panic. Discipline. History shows that decapitation strikes can weaken a state, but they do not guarantee collapse. In fact, sometimes they do the opposite. Sometimes they harden the system. Sometimes they remove the few figures with enough weight to negotiate, restrain, or balance internal factions. Sometimes they leave power in the hands of narrower, angrier, more ideological actors. A regime can become less stable and more dangerous at the same time. That is the real warning tonight. Israel has shown extraordinary capability. No honest observer can deny it. But capability is not the same thing as control. A kill chain is not a win chain. If the enemy keeps losing leaders, but the war keeps getting bigger, more expensive, and harder to contain, then what we are looking at is not strategic resolution. It is strategic deepening. And that is the deeper truth behind this strike. Israel may have removed one of Iran's most important men. But the war itself is not shrinking. It is widening. The battlefield is widening. The economic shock is widening. The political risk is widening. So the question is no longer whether Israel can strike the top of Iran's power structure. It can. The question now is whether anyone still has a credible plan for the war that begins after the strike succeeds. Why Ali Larijani mattered. The man Israel killed was more than a senior official. To understand why Ali Larijani's death matters, you have to stop thinking about titles and start thinking about architecture. States like Iran do not run on speeches alone. They run on channels, permissions, loyalties, and trusted intermediaries. They run on men who know which institution can move, which faction must be calmed, which commander must be heard, and which crisis can still be contained before it becomes a rupture. Ali Larijani was one of those men. That is why his death is not just another entry on a wartime casualty list. It is the removal of a structural pillar inside a regime already under severe pressure. In Washington, people often make the same mistake when they look at authoritarian systems. They assume the visible leader is the whole story. He is not. Real power sits in the connections beneath him, the figures who translate ideology into policy, policy into enforcement, and enforcement into survival. Larijani lived in that layer of power. He was not just close to the center. He helped the center function. That distinction matters even more after the killing of Ali Khamenei. Once the supreme leader was gone, Iran did not simply lose a symbol. It lost the man who anchored legitimacy, hierarchy, and final authority. In that kind of vacuum, the state depends even more heavily on trusted operators who can hold the machinery together. Larijani was one of the few men in Tehran who could move across the full spectrum of that machinery. He understood the security state. He understood the political class. He understood the nuclear file. He understood the language of internal control and the language of external bargaining. That combination is rare in any regime. In a regime under bombardment, it becomes priceless. And that is exactly why he was dangerous to Israel, but also why his death may make the system more volatile, not simply weaker. Larijani was no moderate in the way American audiences use that word. He belonged to the Islamic Republic. He was tied to repression. He was part of the power structure that crushed dissent and defended the state when it felt cornered. There should be no moral confusion about that. But serious analysis cannot stop at moral labeling. The real question is what kind of man he was inside the regime's internal economy of power. He was a bridge. He was one of the few figures with the credibility to speak to hardliners without sounding weak and to speak to negotiators without sounding naive. He had the pedigree, the experience, and the strategic patience that gave him weight across rival camps. That made him useful in war, but it also made him useful in any future effort to limit war. Remove a man like that, and you do not just damage command. You damage the regime's capacity for calibrated decision-making. There is another layer here that is even more explosive. Larijani was widely believed to oppose Mojtaba Khamenei's elevation. If that is true, then his death strikes directly at the balance of power inside the post-Khamenei order. This was not only the elimination of a wartime coordinator. It may also have been the elimination of a political counterweight, a man who could complicate, slow, or challenge the tightening grip of a more hereditary and more security-centered transition. That has consequences. When a regime loses a figure who can balance factions, the system rarely becomes cleaner. It becomes rougher. Decision-making narrows. Fear rises. Internal trust falls. The loudest men in the room gain more influence, especially when they control guns, surveillance, and coercion. In practical terms, that means Larijani's death may not just weaken Tehran. It may shift Tehran further toward harder, more brittle rule. That is the deeper significance of this moment. Israel did not just kill a senior official. It removed one of the few men who could carry authority across the fractured organs of the Iranian state. In the short term, that creates shock. In the medium term, it creates distortion. And in the long term, it may reshape who gets to define survival inside the Islamic Republic. That is why Ali Larijani mattered. Not because of the office he held, but because of the system he helped hold together. Iran is wounded, not defeated. Hormuz, oil, and the global cost of underestimating Tehran. The easiest mistake in this war is to look at Iran's losses and assume those losses automatically add up to defeat. They do not. Iran is wounded, badly wounded, but a wounded state is not the same thing as a broken state. In some cases, it becomes more dangerous precisely because it can no longer compete on every level and begins concentrating on the one lever that can still hurt everyone else. For Iran, that lever is not only military. It is economic, maritime, and psychological. And it runs straight through the Strait of Hormuz. That is where this story becomes much bigger than Tehran, much bigger than Israel, and much more personal for the United States than many Americans may want to believe. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is one of the pressure valves of the world economy. A huge share of globally traded oil and liquefied natural gas moves through that corridor. That means Iran does not need to defeat Israel on the battlefield to shake the international system. It only needs to make the flow of energy look uncertain. In modern markets, fear itself is a weapon. Traders do not wait for total closure. Insurers do not wait for total disaster. Prices move on risk, on probability, on the belief that disruption may get worse tomorrow. That is how one regional war starts showing up at gas stations, in shipping rates, in electricity costs, and eventually in kitchen table anxiety across the world. This is why underestimating Tehran is such a serious analytical failure. People hear decapitation strikes and assume the other side must be losing control. But states like Iran do not survive for decades by relying on one layer of power alone. They survive by building redundancy, ideology, and asymmetric tools. Iran may lose senior figures and still preserve the ability to create external pain. In fact, once direct command becomes less stable, the regime may lean even harder on the tools it still trusts: missiles, drones, maritime disruption, proxy pressure, and economic shock. That is not victory. But it is leverage. And leverage is often enough to prevent the other side from turning battlefield success into strategic closure. This is where Americans need to think clearly. A Middle East war does not have to land on U.S. soil to land in the American economy. If oil prices keep rising, gasoline rises. If shipping becomes riskier, transport costs rise. If energy markets stay unstable, inflation pressures strengthen. And when inflation returns, the political consequences come fast. Families feel it before think tanks explain it. Markets feel it before press secretaries spin it. That is the ugly brilliance of choke point strategy. It translates distant conflict into immediate cost. Iran understands that logic. It knows it cannot outmatch the combined force aligned against it in a straight conventional contest. But it also knows that it does not need to win cleanly to create strategic stress. It only needs to convince the world that the war now carries an open-ended price tag. Once that happens, every actor starts recalculating. Allies hesitate. Importers panic. Governments hedge. Voters lose patience. That is how a wounded regime preserves relevance. There is also a deeper historical lesson here. States under extreme pressure often stop optimizing for elegant victory and start optimizing for endurance and disruption. They ask a colder question: if we cannot dominate, how do we make domination too expensive for everyone else? That is not a theory. It is one of the oldest survival instincts in geopolitics. And right now, Iran is applying it with brutal clarity. So no, Tehran is not emerging from this war looking strong. Its leadership has been penetrated, its structure shaken, its vulnerabilities exposed. But strength is not the only standard that matters. Capacity to impose cost matters too. Capacity to spread instability matters. Capacity to turn a battlefield defeat into a global economic headache matters. That is the danger of this moment. Israel may be proving that Iran can be hit at the top. Iran is proving that even from a weakened position, it can still touch the bloodstream of the global economy. And when a wounded state can still move oil, fear, and prices, no serious person should call it defeated. Beirut, the Gulf, and the expanding fire, this is no longer just an Israel-Iran war. What makes this stage of the war so dangerous is not only the violence itself. It is the geography of that violence. The fire is no longer staying where leaders once pretended it could stay. It is no longer contained inside the narrow frame of Israel and Iran exchanging blows. It is moving through Beirut, across the Gulf, around military bases, over shipping lanes, and dangerously close to critical infrastructure that the entire region depends on. That is not a side effect. That is the new shape of the war. Beirut is the clearest warning. When strikes move beyond Hezbollah's traditional strongholds and hit central districts like Bachura, Basta, and Zuqaq al-Blat, the meaning changes immediately. This is no longer a war that civilians can mentally file away as something happening over there, in the usual militant zones. It moves into the civic heart of a capital city. It moves closer to ministries, offices, apartment blocks, traffic routes, and ordinary daily life. Once that happens, the war stops looking selective and starts feeling ambient. It becomes a condition, not an event. That matters politically because capital cities are not just physical places. They are symbols of state continuity. When central Beirut is hit, the message is larger than the tactical target. The message is that the space between militia infrastructure and national civic space is collapsing. For Lebanon, that is devastating. This is a country already hollowed out by financial collapse, political paralysis, institutional weakness, and social exhaustion. Every new strike does more than destroy concrete. It strips away another layer of public confidence that the state can still protect its own center. And once confidence collapses, secondary damage begins. Families flee. Businesses shut down. Insurance dries up. Informal networks replace formal ones. Fear takes over time itself, because people stop planning weeks ahead and start thinking only in hours. That is how urban warfare quietly becomes state erosion. Now widen the map to the Gulf, and the same pattern appears in a different form. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain are all being forced into a constant defensive posture. Air defenses intercept missiles and drones. Alerts sound over cities built to project stability and commercial confidence. A projectile lands near a base in the UAE hosting Australian personnel. Even when interceptors work, the political effect is still serious. The point is not only what gets through. The point is that the region's economic core is now living under the rhythm of repeated threat. That has major consequences. Gulf power is built not just on oil, but on reliability. Reliability attracts investment, logistics, aviation, finance, and long-term planning. When repeated attacks start chipping away at that reliability, the damage spreads beyond the security sector. It reaches capital flows, business sentiment, travel confidence, and the broader credibility of the Gulf as a predictable zone in an unpredictable region. Iraq adds another layer of instability. Erbil remains exposed. Iran-backed armed groups continue to pressure U.S. interests. That means the war is not only spreading outward. It is spreading through overlapping structures of power, states, militias, proxies, foreign forces, and local governments all operating in the same stressed environment. The more those layers overlap, the easier it becomes for one strike, one interception, one misread signal to trigger a wider rupture. Then there is Bushehr. Even without major damage, the fact that a projectile hit the premises of a nuclear power complex should sober everyone immediately. A war can survive many things. It does not survive nuclear miscalculation cleanly. Once conflict drifts near infrastructure with radiological implications, the margin for error becomes terrifyingly small. This is why the old language no longer works. This is not just an Israel-Iran war with regional echoes. It is now a regional systems crisis with multiple active fronts, multiple vulnerable states, and no dependable firewall between military escalation and civilian breakdown. The battlefield is widening faster than the diplomacy, faster than the public messaging, and faster than the willingness of leaders to admit how much control they may already be losing. That is the real danger now. Not simply that the war is expanding, but that it is expanding through connected systems that no single actor can fully contain once they begin to fail together. Trump, NATO, and the fracturing West, America is moving deeper while its allies step back. What may matter most in this war is not only what is happening over Iran, Israel, or Lebanon. It is what this war is starting to expose inside the West itself. Power is one thing. Cohesion is another. And right now, those two things are moving in opposite directions. Donald Trump is pushing the United States deeper into the crisis at the exact moment many of America's allies are signaling that they do not want to go where this war may lead. That gap is not a minor diplomatic irritation. It is a strategic warning. Because wars are not sustained by military force alone. They are sustained by alliance discipline, political legitimacy, and a shared understanding of what victory is supposed to look like. When those three things start drifting apart, even the strongest coalition begins to weaken from the inside. That is what we are seeing now around the Strait of Hormuz. Trump wants support. He wants allied help securing the waterway, restoring commercial flow, and proving that the West can still impose order on a critical global choke point. On paper, that sounds reasonable. Hormuz matters to the entire world. Energy markets depend on it. Global shipping depends on it. The credibility of deterrence depends on it. But real alliances do not move on paper. They move on trust, and right now trust is thin. European governments are not simply hesitating because they lack courage. They are hesitating because they do not see a clean end state. They do not know whether this is a limited operation, an open-ended military commitment, or the front edge of a larger campaign that could pull them into a conflict with no stable finish line. And that uncertainty changes everything. Once allies start asking whether the mission is expanding faster than the explanation, they begin protecting themselves politically before they commit themselves militarily. That is the core problem for Washington. America is still carrying the heaviest military weight, but it is no longer carrying unquestioned strategic consent. Those are not the same thing. A superpower can move first. It can strike hardest. It can dominate escalation in the short term. But if allies begin to see the mission as too vague, too risky, or too driven by pressure rather than planning, they pull back. Quietly at first. Then more openly. And once that process starts, every additional request from Washington sounds less like leadership and more like burden transfer. The domestic picture inside the United States makes this even more fragile. Joe Kent's resignation cut deeper than many officials would like to admit. When a senior counterterrorism official walks away and says Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States, that is not a routine dispute. That is a direct challenge to the political and moral foundation of the war. It tells the American public that even inside the national security system, there is no full consensus on why this war is being fought, how far it should go, or what standard of danger justified it. And once that doubt enters the public space, the clock starts ticking faster. U.S. casualties rise. Fuel costs rise. Market anxiety rises. Congressional pressure rises. In a democracy, wars lose public strength when the price becomes visible before the purpose becomes clear. That is not weakness. That is political reality. This is why the alliance picture matters so much. If Donald Trump keeps moving deeper while NATO allies keep stepping back, the United States may find itself in the most dangerous position of all, strong enough to continue the war, but increasingly alone in defining it. That is not a formula for stable victory. It is a formula for strategic drift. And drift is how powerful countries get trapped. Not because they lose the ability to strike, but because they keep striking while the coalition around them loses confidence in where the road ends. That is the fracture line now opening inside the West. And if it widens, it may prove every bit as consequential as the battlefield itself. What comes next? Regime collapse, hardline consolidation, or a long war nobody truly controls? So what comes next? That is the question hanging over this war now, and it is the question too many leaders still refuse to answer with honesty. Because once a conflict reaches this stage, after decapitation strikes, widening regional fronts, economic shock, alliance strain, and rising civilian fear, the future no longer moves in a straight line. It fractures. It opens several paths at once. And every one of them carries danger. The first possibility is the one Israel clearly wants the world to imagine: regime collapse. In this scenario, the repeated killing of senior figures like Ali Larijani and Gholamreza Soleimani does more than damage Iran's command structure. It breaks the regime's image of inevitability. It tells the public that the men who claim to protect the Islamic Republic cannot even protect themselves. Over time, that kind of exposure can become politically fatal. Authoritarian systems survive not only through force, but through the myth of permanence. Once that myth cracks, fear begins to travel in both directions. The population fears the state less, and the state fears the population more. That is not an impossible outcome. Iran has deep public anger beneath the surface. It has lived through protest waves, generational frustration, economic stagnation, corruption, and repression. A regime that loses its commanding figures while failing to restore stability can reach a point where its own weakness becomes visible faster than it can hide it. And when that happens, a single symbolic break can trigger a wider internal shift. But serious analysis has to say what many partisans will not: collapse is possible, not guaranteed. The second path may actually be more likely in the immediate term, and it is darker. That path is hardline consolidation. This is what happens when a regime under attack stops pretending to be broad and simply becomes narrower, harsher, and more openly ruled by its most security-driven elements. If figures like Ali Larijani disappear, and if balancing actors inside the system keep being removed, then power does not vanish. It condenses. It flows toward the institutions with guns, surveillance, ideological discipline, and the least patience for restraint. That means the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the deeper coercive networks of the state could emerge from this crisis with even more influence than before. Not because Iran is stronger, but because crisis rewards organization. In unstable systems, the best organized faction usually wins the internal struggle, not the most popular one, not the most sophisticated one, and certainly not the most reform-minded one. History is brutal on that point. Then there is the third path, and for now it may be the most realistic, a long war that nobody truly controls. Not total collapse. Not clear consolidation. Just rolling escalation. A war that keeps changing shape without reaching a clean decision. Israel continues to strike. Iran continues to retaliate. Beirut remains exposed. Hormuz remains unstable. Oil remains nervous. The West remains divided. Markets remain tense. Diplomacy remains weak. The region does not explode all at once, but it also does not heal. It just bleeds, slowly and expensively, in a way that drains everyone. That kind of war is especially dangerous because people get used to it. Policymakers start treating instability as normal. Markets learn to live with higher risk. Civilians adapt to fear. And once that happens, the absence of disaster gets mistaken for strategy. But drift is not strategy. Endurance is not resolution. And managing crisis month by month is not the same as shaping peace. This is why the death of Ali Larijani may prove even more consequential over time than it looks today. His removal may weaken Tehran, yes. But it may also remove one of the last figures inside the Iranian system with the weight to coordinate power across institutions and, potentially, to navigate a controlled political exit if one ever became possible. When a regime loses men who can balance force with calculation, what often remains is not surrender. It is rigidity. And rigid systems are dangerous systems. They make worse decisions. They misread signals. They overcorrect. They escalate because they no longer know how to de-escalate without looking weak. That is the real horizon of this war. Not a neat ending. Not a cinematic turning point. But a hard strategic truth. Israel has demonstrated extraordinary power. Iran has demonstrated enduring capacity to disrupt. The United States and its allies now face the question that defines every serious conflict in the modern age, not whether they can keep hitting targets, but whether they can still shape what comes after the targets are gone. Because if no one can answer that question clearly, then this war is not approaching resolution. It is approaching a new and more dangerous phase. Ali Larijani's story is not just the story of one man rising through the ranks of the Islamic Republic. It is the story of how power really works inside a state under pressure. He was not simply a public official with a title. He was a bridge between institutions, a coordinator between the military and the political class, a negotiator who understood both force and calculation, and a figure trusted enough to help hold together a regime entering one of the most dangerous periods in its history. His death matters because it reveals something larger than personal fate. When a system loses the people who connect its parts, the whole structure becomes more brittle, more reactive, and more dangerous. That is the deeper lesson here for all of us. Power is not only about who stands at the top. It is about who holds systems together behind the scenes. In politics, in business, and even in everyday life, the strongest structure is never the loudest one. It is the one that can absorb pressure, manage conflict, and keep functioning when conditions turn hostile. When wisdom, balance, and coordination disappear, raw force often fills the vacuum. And raw force, by itself, rarely creates stability. That lesson applies directly to modern life. In our jobs, our families, our communities, and even our personal finances, we should not only chase visible success. We should build resilience. We should become people who can think clearly under pressure, connect divided sides, and act with discipline when emotions run high. Because in moments of crisis, the people who matter most are often not the loudest voices, but the ones who can keep a fragile system from breaking apart. Now here's a quick question for you. Do you believe the killing of Ali Larijani makes the Iranian regime A. weaker and closer to collapse? Or B. more dangerous because hardliners may tighten control? Comment A or B below. And what do you think overall? Does this war look like strategic victory, or the start of something even more unstable? Share your view in the comments so everyone can learn from your perspective. And if you value sharp, serious analysis like this, subscribe to the channel and support the mission so we can keep bringing you deeper, stronger content ahead.